Hello and welcome everyone to this fourth episode of our Gruyter Corona Talks, today with the fantastic Viv Newman. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor and a pleasure.
After Viv's talk today, we will have a quick Q&A session just between the two of us, and then opening the discussion to questions from the audience. And I'll start by quickly introducing Viv. Viv Newman is an independent author and researcher with a PhD from the University of Essex, where she used to work. She's passionate about uncovering the forgotten women of World War I, and she writes for the military publishers Pen and Sword, her latest book being Children at War, 1914 to 1918, which was published in 2019. And she also quite recently published with us in the essay collection Perspectives on the Pandemic, Thinking in a State of Exception, and her essay in this collection is the basis for today's talk, which is called COVID and World War I Nursing, When Adapting is the Name of the Game. So Vivian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you to talk about a passion of mine, as Maria has mentioned, nursing and women in the First World War. And of course, our interest in nursing, I think, has increased over the months of the pandemic. So without further ado, let us get going and talk about when nursing and adapting is the name of the game. Can you see my screen? Have I managed to share it?
Not yet.
Not yet, right. Slight hiccup. Sorry. Let me go and get my tech assistant quickly. I will be with you in just a minute. Sorry, technical hitch. It was all good.
That's fine, we have time.
Come on, take it back to.
Looking good.
Looking good? Are we getting there?
Yes.
There we are. We can start. I'm sorry about that. I'm more a historian than a technical person. So, when adapting is the name of the game. In October 1916, faced with acute shortages of medical equipment, British nurse Yvonne Fitzroy concluded, "What we haven't got, we invent, and what we can't invent, we do without." This could easily refer to 21st century responses to COVID-19. Medical services and suppliers have had to rethink and rapidly adapt to meet the pandemic's challenges. World War I nursing personnel also thought outside the box to cope with the challenges they faced and provide the wounded with the best possible care. By late February 2020, it was clear that some hospitals in France and Italy were overwhelmed by the rising numbers of critically ill patients. Some of these would need rapidly evacuating to alternative facilities. Trains were adapted so that within a matter of days, they began to resemble hospital wards. Similarly, in World War I, casualties had to be transported as quickly as possible. Initially, as nurse Kate Luard explained in September 1914, these were not fit for purpose. She wrote, "You boarded a cattle truck armed with a tray of dressings. The men were lying on straw. They had been in trains for several days. Many wounds were gangrenous. No one grumbled or made any fuss, more ghastly than anything I have ever seen or smelt." Fortunately, things improved. Trains were converted to ambulance trains. Kate considered these cutting edge apart from one drawback. They had no corridors, so, ignoring official prohibitions, nurses clambered from coach to coach while in motion by way of the outside footboard. Don't forget, these women were wearing ankle-length skirts. They also carried a load on their backs which contained dressings, medicines, etc. And in addition, during the night, when going from one coach to another, the sisters had to carry hurricane lamps suspended from their arms. Kate was very proud of her expertise at clawing along the footboards. Mirroring so many of today's nurses' disregard for their own personal safety, nurses simply accepted that they could not do otherwise, knowing that men on each coach might perhaps be dying for want of attention. If trains, both then and now, are used to move patients quickly, during the Great War, the lives of some of the most severely wounded depended on being jolted as little as possible. As northern France is riddled with waterways, barges were pressed into service. However, it is almost miraculous that many survived the embarkation process. They were lowered by ropes and pulleys, often worked by the barge's cook, through the open top of the barge to the wards below. Despite these apparent shortcomings, the British popular press were in raptures about this mode of transport, which is the most ideal means of conveying wounded, as, although it may be slow, wounded men are in no hurry, and it can be as well and economically attended to on these barges as in hospital tents. It was very lucky they were in no hurry. Bad weather could delay a journey by as much as 72 hours. Shortages of essential materials, which we have all heard so much about throughout this pandemic, from toilet rolls to pasta, are also nothing new. One barge nurse pleaded with her parents to send her the abrasive cleaner Vim. Another longed for a simple pudding recipe book, as, on her barge at least, the cook was either unimaginative or unskilled when it came to puddings. He could produce only sago or stewed fruit. Difficulties of life on board extended beyond needing Vim, recipes, or even nursing men who were frequently more dead than alive. Some barges were barely fit for purpose. One nurse wrote, "Our barge became more and more leaky until we simply paddled from bed to bed." In winter, slippery decks meant some nurses taking an unexpected dip in the freezing canal, and many took to crawling along the decks in a rather undignified all fours. In addition to their nursing duties, when patients were offloaded, the nurses had to clean with or without Vim, a demanding and essential task, as soldiers could be evacuated straight to the barge from the battlefield. The men were often filthy and lice-ridden, and when they had been gassed, poor barge ventilation meant that other patients and staff would suffer a mild gas attack, which could lead to breathing problems and worse. Being bitten by lice could lead nurses to develop typhus and trench fever. Catching infections from patients has always been a hazard facing the nursing profession. A Chinese corona nurse and poet, Long Qialing, who rushed to Wuhan in January 2020, expressed this in a poem simply and beautifully. As people tried to praise her, she explained that she was merely acting on a healer's conscience. Somehow, to me, this sums up the dedication and sacrifices made by nurses, both then and now. Another striking similarity between the Great War and corona nursing is the shortage of PPE, or personal protective equipment. The need for face masks and make your own is not simply a product of this pandemic. Masks exercised the minds of two volunteer nurses with the Belgian army in April 1915. Woken by the sound of firing, everyone began to cough and choke. One woman wrote, "Out of the queer green haze that hung over everything came an unending stream of soldiers, stumbling, staggering, gasping, all a livid green colour. It was, of course, the first gas attack." A high-ranking British officer asked the women for details of the Belgian-issued respirators and the chemicals they contained, and whether we considered them effective at any distance from gas. the women were too embarrassed to explain that they had fashioned their own relatively efficient gas masks out of Mr. Southall's hygienic towels for ladies, in themselves an invention only dating back to the early 1890s. Masks eventually became more efficient, even if there were never really enough to go round. One problem that women should not have to face in the 21st century, but which came to light for nurses in a Wuhan hospital, was with menstrual protection. When nurses asked their male supervisors to help get them such products, they were told they lacked the spirit of devotion. One nurse said at that point she felt that her whole spirit was breaking down slowly. We are now all familiar with the countless staff who have travelled far and wide to volunteer on Corona front lines. This too is mirrored in the Great War. As soon as war broke out, Australian nurses rushed overseas. Amongst them was one called Elsie Tranter. Her war service included working in casualty clearing stations, which were very close to the front line. Nursing was often accompanied by the sounds of firing, which, thankfully, is at least one thing our COVID nurses have not had to deal with. Elsie wrote, "We can hear the guns quite plainly. Such a noisy night. Shells were whistling and screaming. Then there was a horrific explosion and the wounded began pouring in." Although the Anglophone press eulogized nurses' unflappability, as they called it, Elsie admitted to the need for a good dose of Australian mateship. "Being with others made us feel safer," she wrote. "You can't face these things alone, but with a pal beside you, you feel strong enough to face danger. If alone in your hut, you live every moment in dread until the bombing is clear." It is worth adding that alone in your hut actually meant being the only nurse caring for perhaps 500 very severely wounded men, almost everyone unable to save himself should the casualty clearing station be shelled. Of course, even in a crisis, life does have its lighter side. Many of us, I'm sure, have bewailed the closure of hairdressers. Nowadays, of course, washing hair is at least relatively easy. This was not the case in 1918. So I thought I would close with one of my favourite Elsie Tranter stories. Desperate to get her long, now filthy hair washed, and with a few precious hours off duty, she walked into what remained the town of Camier. To her dismay, all the hairdressers seemed to have left town. However, I saw a little shop with all manner of toilet requisites in the window, and Madame, who looked as if she couldn't say no, standing at the door. I made my request in the very best French I could command. Soon, there was another problem: drying the hair. Madame became greatly distressed. Then she was struck with a brilliant idea. Opening the oven door and placing a cushion on the floor in front of it, she bade me sit down and put my head in the oven. A novel way, but it answered the purpose. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know Elsie survived both her hairdressing and her nursing experiences, and she returned to Australia in 1919. Between 1914 and 1919, approximately 25,000 professional nurses cared for occupants of the 746 hospital beds at home and at sea in all theatres of war. Approximately 1,000 professional nurses from Great Britain and her dominions, and 500 volunteer nursing and ancillary staff lost their lives as a direct result of their war service. According to The Guardian, by the 22nd of May 2020, some 200 medical and care home staff had died of coronavirus in Great Britain. In the USA, the number appears to be at least 3 times higher, whilst figures in China suggest that exhaustion, as well as the virus itself, have accounted for many deaths. To date, of course, no worldwide figures are available for the number of medical staff who have lost their lives due to the pandemic. Writing in 1916, British nurse Beatriz Hopkinson commented, "I never knew what duty was until this war." I'm quite sure that 100 years on, nurses and other healthcare professionals would echo her sentiments. Today's nurses' dedication, their ingenuity, and of course, their personal sacrifices are summed up in the simple words a wounded soldier spoke to naval nurse Anna Cameron a century ago. "Thank God we have the nurses." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viv, for this fascinating talk and the insight into the world of First World War nursing, and also shining a light on the sometimes very cunning similarities to today's health crisis. So if you're okay with it, I'll just dive right into some questions I have.
Do, please.
So nurses today, they are, of course, as you already said, they are not in a war, but they are working around the clock 24/7, sometimes 7 days a week. And they use all sorts of different means to cope with the situation, like drawing, writing diaries, writing short stories. Did nurses in the First World War do similar things, or was there, because they were in the war, no time to worry about those things at all?
Absolutely, there are some amazing diaries, nurses, and indeed poetry. And I think it's very interesting that poetry seems to so often strike some sort of a nerve with people. It's as though they need to express their ideas in a slightly different form. There's been some amazing, what I call corona poetry that's around at the moment, and that was just very much the case in the Great War. A number of nursing poets. One woman I find particularly fascinating because I think she demonstrates just the need to write poetry, and also what we could call a very fascinating gender reversal. She was a nurse. The person that she was having an affair with was working on the staff. He was in the army, but he was in the staff. And so he was in a, if you like, a safe job, whereas she was the one very close to the front line who was facing much greater danger. And she writes at one point that she is a woman with black blood upon her face, a cap of horror on her pallid hair, whereas he has a proud, untainted brow. It's suddenly she is the one who has become, if you like, the casualty of war, and he is the one who is what we would imagine to be in the woman's space of the home, the safe space. And there are lots and lots of Great War poets, lots of nursing Great War poets, but to my mind, Mary Borden says it all. She just hits the nail on the head with her poetry. So poetry was a great medium for expressing fears, hopes, distress, and also humor. There are many humorous poems as well, and we all need humor in times of crisis.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Because when I read about nurses, for instance, coming from Australia, going to Egypt, and their diary entries, they often give the impression of being helplessly outnumbered by wounded soldiers, of course, like in 300 or 500 to 6 sometimes. So I was wondering how they managed to keep up their spirit.
Well, there's one fascinating story actually of an Australian nurse. First of all, she lied about her age to go with the nursing service. She actually lost 10 years. We know all about the youngsters who lied about their age because they were too young. There were women who were going the other way. They were lying about their age because they were too old. So this wonderful person who became known as Mother Anzac, she actually sort of lost 10 years off her age when she was filling in her application form. And she was a physiotherapist as well as a nurse. And she used to be revived by the boys because they would hand her a flask of whiskey. So she would keep her spirits up, quite literally. And when somebody tried to put some ice in it, she was very disdainful, and she said whiskey should be drunk neat. And so that was one way of keeping the spirits up. I'm not saying that all the nurses, but she just sticks in my mind as just being a great example of adapting, finding a way to cope. So she would have her tot of whiskey before every massage.
I can see the similarities to today as well.
Yes.
So nurses, I think no one would argue that they are very important, not only during a war, but especially during a war. And today as well, because we see governments and people standing on balconies clapping for nurses and medical staff. But still, you get the sense we don't value nurses enough, especially since it seems always to be about the doctors, which of course there's the gender component to it, especially in the First World War. Not as much anymore, but it's still there. And also the hierarchical component.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this was very much the case in the First World War, because it was always the doctor who seemed to be the one that everybody had to bend their knee to. And the nurses sometimes in their diaries will actually write very negative comments about the doctors. Basically, they don't know what they're saying, so we'll listen to them and then we'll go ahead and do it the way that we know is the correct way to do it. There's quite a great story about Agatha Christie, the great crime writer, who was actually a volunteer nurse during the Great War, and she writes in her autobiography in a very sort of cross way about the way that nurses were supposed to address the doctors as though they were one step down from God. And she slightly gets her own back in her crime novels, because there's more than one occasion where she turns the doctor into a murderer. And even a modern psychiatrist has written very recently, I think it was in 2018, might have been 2015, but anyway, as recently as that Agatha Christie doesn't really have much respect for our profession. And I think it was some nurses shared that disrespect at the time, although in the very gendered hierarchical society, they had to appear as though they were basically worshipping the doctor, but they frequently weren't, and they had much better solutions very often as to what they would do. And of course, there was also the female doctors were very much seen as second or even third class citizens. And very often at the beginning of the war in Britain, when they tried to volunteer to work with the army, they were turned down and told to go home and knit a sock and not possibly interfere with the medical profession. It changed as the war progressed, but there was very much a feeling that really women, female medics, had no place in war. And after the war, despite their enormous success with war medicine, they were then sent back into gynecology and pediatrics, which were considered the suitable specialisms for women. So it didn't change. There was a brief window of light from about 1916 to 1918, and then the curtain came back down again for them.
I feel like we're doing a little better maybe today, but not as good as we could be in valuing.
We're not there yet.
So, given that nurses were so very important, were there any kind of statues, monuments, memorials built after the First World War? I know of one that was built in France, I think, in 1924, but anywhere else? And if there were some, what why were they built? Where were the initiatives coming from?
Interestingly, the only full statue of a nurse that I know of in Great Britain is the one in London to Edith Cavell, which in itself is a sort of a different story, and that was more because of her execution than because of her nursing service. Her sister actually was very against the idea of there being a statue to her because she felt it's not what Edith would have wanted. That was unveiled in March 1920, and it became almost a sort of a site of pilgrimage for nurses. Intriguingly, there is actually a memorial, a stained glass window in a church to a nurse of the South African War who died in 1900, and she is believed to have be the first nurse to be honoured by a memorial. That's actually in Lancashire, and there is a stained glass window that was funded by nurses from her home hospital, which was the London Hospital, and that was dedicated in about 1904 or 1905. Nurses' names are on war memorials, but there is not a statue that I know of. That's not to say that there isn't, but there's not a statue that I know of in the UK absolutely to a nurse. Probably with what's going on with the statue movement these days, probably the poor woman would get toppled if it might not be a very safe place to be these days. But at the moment, Edith Cavell is quite secure up there. She's still on her plinth. Interesting, the sculptor of the statue refused any payment, although funds were raised by public subscription for the statue to Cavell. He actually refused to take any payment for it.
Wow.
But which was quite unusual.
Yeah.
And I believe that there's one to her and the other nurse of the hospital that she worked in. I believe there's one in Brussels to Cavell, but they're not many. But then
not nearly enough.
No.
And were nurses accepted by soldiers or by men as equals, more or less equals, or did they have to basically prove themselves over and over again as competent assets because women had no place on the battlefield?
To begin with, my feeling is that there was some antagonism, although from the beginning of the 20th century, from the 1900s, of course, you've got Florence Nightingale, but then by the 1900s, there was actually an army auxiliary nursing service. So soldiers were quite used to women, although it was considered that male orderlies should do the really dirty work, but that changed obviously during the First World War. But nurses did tend to be accepted, often with enormous relief by the men. They were generally delighted to be nursed by a woman rather than the male orderlies, because they were seen to be skilled. And I think by 1914 they had become quite widely accepted as part of the nursing scene. I mean, there were stories, and I think they are true rather than apocryphal, that they tended to if a nurse was very attractive, they would make sure that she didn't nurse the officers. They would put her nursing the other ranks as opposed to the officers, because they thought that the other ranks might know their place and might not be too forward with the nurses, whereas the officers might. So there was almost this class hierarchy was also working, as it did within the Army Nursing Service. To be a full-blown military nurse, you had to be a member of at least the middle class, or what would be considered an officer's daughter, whereas you could be lower class if you were a member of the territorial forces. So we've got good old British class hierarchy is coming into play. That it altered a bit during the war, but that was it very much at the beginning. There was this class hierarchy that was nicely in place, but then that was inevitable, I suppose, at the time.
So I imagine that the stronger bonds were between the women, the nurses themselves and other women in the war, but there probably were friendships between men and women as well. And maybe they even stayed friends after the war.
Some did. You've got cases almost inevitably of some nurses marrying a patient, but the bonds between nurses themselves were incredibly strong. And there's often sort of felt that there's this great comradeship between men who have fought together. You also get associations of women who nursed together. One that carried on until the 1970s. Women would have the annual reunion of this group of women who had nursed Royaumont in France, and they kept this going up until the 1970s, by which time quite a few of them had died off and some were too frail to attend the reunion meetings. But there was a very strong comradeship that developed between women because they shared a history that others couldn't understand. And that I think was very important, as it was for the men who'd been at the front.
So, did nurses get to choose if they wanted to go to the war, to the front line, or was it something that was decided for them by their employer, like when they were with the Red Cross or else? And if they were able to just volunteer, as so many soldiers did as well in the beginning of the war, how much did, always next to religious beliefs, emancipatory thinking play into this decision? Like, because you mentioned Florence Nightingale, and of course she was way earlier, but maybe she also served as a role model for some of the nurses.
I think she did very, very much, and the sort of to be a Nightingale nurse was considered a great honour to actually sort of achieve the award of a Nightingale nurse. In terms of Red Cross, the auxiliary nurses, they were desperate. Many of them were desperate to get to France or to get overseas. And if you were selected for overseas service, it was considered a huge achievement and accolade. Women had to be, I think it was over the age of 21 in order to go overseas. Some, because they had home duties and concerns, they couldn't volunteer, couldn't go overseas. In terms of the army nurses, many of them were asked to go, and generally, if they were given the opportunity, they absolutely jumped at it, because it was seen as first of all, it was almost sort of validation of their skills, and also that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to nurse the boys as close to the front line as possible. To then be selected for a casualty clearing station as opposed to a hospital further back, to be selected for a casualty clearing station was again considered a great honour. And the Beatriz Hopkinson, who I mentioned at the end, and her sense of duty, she was very thrilled that she was actually chosen to go to a casualty clearing station, although she found the experience very, very grueling, as anybody would do. To go and nurse the boys there, they felt that they were really contributing in a very significant way to the war effort by doing that.
Again, because I think you also wrote a fair amount on suffragettes during the war. Was that something that played a role among nurses as well?
Yes, and there were suffrage supporting nurses as well as non-suffrage, anti-suffrage nurses. I don't think amongst the nursing population, suffragism became very, very important, apart from one group known as the Scottish Women's Hospital for Overseas Services. They were actually founded and funded by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and throughout the war they got no money at all from the British government. Throughout the war they were tapping very much into suffrage sources to fund them. And Yvonne Fitzroy, who I mentioned right at the beginning, she was working with this organization, and they really never missed an opportunity to promote women's suffrage at the same time as women medics, nurses, radiographers. They had a massive organization, probably the most effective and the most efficient of all the nursing organisations, and they, in their letters home that have been preserved, you'll even see sort of on the back of their envelopes, they're writing things like "Votes for Women." They were very conscious of their dual role and dual contribution. But for the majority of nurses, I think suffrage was just an issue, but not the overriding issue.
Yeah, and that was probably especially true for the UK nurses, for the British nurses, because the movement was not as strong at this time in other countries.
Yes, and of course, Australian women were already enfranchised, and in fact, there was an Australian woman who came over, worked with there was one actually British hospital that was mainly staffed by suffrage women, and she actually couldn't understand all this big fuss about suffrage, because to her Australian women had the vote, and she actually wrote home and said, "I wish they'd get off their banging this drum about suffrage, it's getting awfully boring." Whereas this group of women always tried to promote the cause as much as they could. So, and Canadian nurses, I seem to remember, they were actually allowed to vote in the Canadian general elections because of their war service. It was considered that as men had been allowed to vote, then nurses who served overseas should also be given that privilege.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's dragged up out of my memory from somewhere. I'm pretty certain it's accurate. I'll double check it later. I shall put on an apology if I'm wrong on that one.
No one will ever know. After the war, when veterans, when they all went home, basically, veterans were treated differently in every country. So some were being honored and decorated for serving, some were reintegrated into society more easily, some were not, and especially the ones experiencing trauma like shell shock had difficulties going back to their lives. How was the situation for the nurses? Were they treated in any kind of way? Because some of them must have suffered the same trauma.
They did. There were a number of nurses. I think that the number is probably sort of in the very low hundreds, maybe sort of somewhere between 80, 90, 100 nurses were actually transferred home because of shell shock. And it was actually recognized that they were neurasthenic. One or two even committed suicide because of the trauma that they had experienced. And there were a few nurses who, even in the 1920s, were still being treated in what were called lunatic asylums for as a result of their shell shock. The authorities were reluctant as ever to admit to it, but there were nurses who actually were known. Their war service had completely damaged their minds. And one or two who'd even been in very high-ranking positions. In fact, Beatriz Hopkinson, one of her matrons, was actually had to be invalided out of she was a regular nurse, she had to be invalided out of the service due to shell shock. And they tried to find her alternative work, but she was just she was unable to cope with it. And she ended up being one of a number of very sad cases. So there has been some research on this group of women. And Mary Borden, the poet that I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of our discussion, she actually ended up with shell shock for a relatively brief length of time, but she definitely was neurasthenic as well. I think it's still an under-researched area as far as women are concerned.
But were some of them also, did they receive any kind of honors after their service?
Yes, not necessarily the ones who were shell-shocked, but there were quite a lot of women who received either the Royal Red Cross, which was considered the equivalent of the military cross for women, and some also received the military medal if they had been very close to the front line and served in a medical capacity. For example, there was an ambulance train that was there were several ambulance trains that were bombed, but on one occasion one ambulance train was bombed, and the nurses, because of their exceptional courage, were decorated with the military medal, which is a medal that was in the British Army at that time, was for other ranks as opposed to officers. And the Canadian government was very cross. They felt that their nurses should have the officer's medal and not the other ranks medal. So there was quite a lot of correspondence actually went on between the War Office, the British War Office, and the Canadian Medical Services, demanding the military cross as opposed to the military medal for their nurses. I think probably the nurses who actually received a military medal were quite happy with it. And there's a wonderful story, which I digress because I always do, about Mother Anzac, the Australian who, with her whiskey, she actually received a decoration. She had to go to London. She'd been working in Egypt. She had to go to London to receive this decoration. She went to Buckingham Palace and she smuggled a small mallet into her handbag and she knocked a chip out of a marble column at Buckingham Palace. Took that home to Australia, and apparently her descendants have it to this day. I keep watching on eBay every so often to see if it appears, but so the nurses were decorated. There was big ceremonies at Buckingham Palace where they would receive their awards. But unlike the men, they had to pay themselves for a new uniform, whereas the men would have their uniform provided for them. The nurses had to buy theirs so that they didn't appear looking dirty in front of the King and Queen.
So again, one last question, because we have to jump to the audience questions because there are quite a few lining up here. So my last is, so during the war, due to the Allied cooperation, French and British soldiers and later also US soldiers, they were fighting basically shoulder to shoulder. And while this probably didn't always work effortlessly and was quite often subject to cultural misunderstandings and distrust and maybe also dislike, did the nurses work together as well, help each other out, maybe even across enemy lines? Were they in contact?
I don't know of any contact across enemy lines. There may well be, but I haven't heard of it. I do know that the Australian and New Zealand nurses, Australians particularly, used to find the British nurses very stuck up, and they would much prefer to work with Australians. They also preferred to nurse their own boys as opposed to British ones. But there was definitely some antagonism between the Dominion nurses and the British ones. And some of the British nurses, when they were working with the French, used to find that quite difficult as well, because they had very different ways of very different nursing practices. So there was conflict, but certainly the Australian ones write about it quite a bit in their diaries, and are always relieved when they're nursing with Australians and not with the stuck up Poms. But maybe that was a fairly typical relationship between the two groups. But what you can say is that when they were faced with emergencies, then they would pull together very, very well. It was just when they had a bit more time and tensions could then mount.
Okay, so I go right to the first questions from the audience, which is, do you feel COVID-19 has led to a new interest in World War I nursing?
Possibly, yes. I think there's an interest in nursing. And in fact, I've noticed in a couple of days ago on the BBC News that there has been an increased number of people applying to train as nurses. So I think that there is an increased interest in nursing. And because World War I nursing is in many ways seen as the sort of the mother of modern nursing, moving beyond Florence Nightingale, I've had quite a lot of interest, people asking me more about it. So I think, yes, it has sparked an interest in the history of nursing. And very often we go to the First World War nursing as the big sort of, if you like, trailblazer for women. And I think after that, it was very nurses were seen quite differently. They were seen as having made such a huge contribution to the medical services.
And has historical research in the past downplayed the role of nurses in World War I or of women generally? And if so, why do you think that is?
The role of women has been enormously downplayed. It's still not known, it's barely known even that out of, for example, out of the 2,000 male poets that were published in the Great War, over a quarter of them were women. So women have been downplayed enormously in the Great War. And because of the automatic privilege of the fighting man, he is seen as being all important in war. And whereas those who patch the fighting man up were seen by many historians as less important, and the real interest in women and in nursing of the Great War only really came in with the sort of the second wave of feminism, where people were beginning to think, let's see what women were doing. But their role is hugely under researched and under talked about. And it's still as though there should be a neat little patch for the women. We'll pop them there. And then all these naughty women historians can be satisfied that they're getting a look in, and the rest of us can get on with the serious business.
They didn't kill, so they don't count.
Exactly, yes. And they used to say there's the great irony that nurses are expected to patch men up so that they can go and kill again.
Yeah. And it's not just nurses. I mean, there were other women in the war as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful comment that the Prime Minister Lloyd George made about the nation's gratitude to the women, and that comment was passed in very early November 1918. And within 2 months, there was the talk about when are these pesky women going to go back and have more babies and look after the men and vacate the jobs. It was as though everything they'd done could be conveniently ignored.
Yeah, that was something I was wondering about after the war. When they went home, did they stay in military service, or did they just go back to their pre-war role? Maybe did they also feel a new sense of autonomy after coming home because of what they experienced during the war and had then trouble adjusting to their old role?
Women, yes, on the whole, they had very significant difficulties in adapting. Those who had been very involved in war service, as of course did the men. The conception is that they just eventually went home and got on with it. A number did. A number were very determined to continue to forge new roles, and they were banging at the door of so many of the professions in order to be allowed in, and began to make their mark in all sorts of different ways. So the story is actually less bleak for women than I think it's reported as being. In terms of military nurses, the military authorities were very careful to not recruit many into the permanent army nursing service. They became reserve, so they could be got rid of again very easily. So for nursing, for women who'd been involved in frontline nursing, I think life became very dull afterwards. Somehow to go back to an appendix seems rather less dramatic. But they had increased skills, which they were then able to use to their advantage. But it's a very mixed picture post-war for women. Some really were able to build on their war service and move forward. Others were pushed back into the four walls of the home. So it's a mixed picture.
Did they receive any pensions at all?
They had to fight for them. Those who got them had to fight much harder even than the men to get them. Some nurses got pensions, but it was very hard to get. And I think the idea was if we make it hard enough, they'll go away and forget about it.
Yeah. Still like that today.
Yes. I was just, as I'm talking, I think, have things really changed?
The next question is, at the beginning of the pandemic, we have seen a new public appreciation of care work. Do you think this will be a long-term trend with real political consequences, or just a fad?
I think it will be cynically, I think it will be a passing phase. I would love to say no, I think it will change, but already I feel that certainly in Britain, there will be a downgrading again, and it will be forgotten. Yes, they were great at the time, because we tend to have short memories. So sadly, my answer is I don't think it will change much.
And we also have much more important things to think about, like the tourism industry or the car industry.
Yes. Somehow, and I think because of the nature of so many nurses in particular, they are carers. They want to care, and so therefore they tend not to be very vocal. And I think it's those who make the most noise sometimes get listened to. Yeah.
They should rely on us to do that too.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Sometimes they need somebody to give them a voice.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
Certainly I think for care workers, they will go back to the bottom of the pile. And already Boris Johnson, certainly in the UK, is almost starting to turn the blame onto care homes for saying, it's their fault that they didn't cope better in the pandemic, which has led to an outcry, but memory is short.
Unbelievable. Okay. Next question is, women are carrying most of the burden of the corona pandemic. Would you agree with that? And do you see similarities to the situation in the First World War?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree with the situation in the First World War, and I think very much also about the men who came back more than anything with the neurasthenics who came back with shell shock, and the huge burden that placed upon their wives and families. Very much as veterans today, still army families are carrying those burdens for their mentally wounded servicemen. And I think that women automatically carry the burden. I think it's been also noticeable in things like sort of home education. Who is it who's trying to organize the children and the teaching? Who is it who's juggling the work and the childcare? I would say 90% of families, it's probably the woman, because there's this sort of feeling that the male job has to be prioritized.
Yeah. I have the feeling that the last 3 months have set us back 30 years.
Yes, I would agree. I think that I don't think it's done us any good.
No.
No. There was this feeling, when both sides are at home, they will share the burdens equally. No. I think probably everybody would say no. In the age group that have got young children at home, it's the mum who's been chasing around doing the schoolwork and coping, juggling.
To do everything this life before, yes.
Yeah.
The next question is something we already kind of talked about, but it goes a little bit further. So the question is, did some of these women, the nurses, end up initiating and influencing the women's suffrage movement in the UK in 1918 or afterwards?
I think that the quick answer to that is almost certainly collectively no, because in February 1918, women over the age of 30 who fulfilled certain property requirements were given the vote. The campaign continued up until 1928, and there was full female enfranchisement. But in many ways, the suffrage movement took a back seat after the war. It became sort of slightly more niche. There were women who were very involved with nurses who were very involved with the suffrage campaign, who took on certain roles after the war, where their suffrage relationship became very strong, working with other suffrage women, but it wasn't particularly campaigning for the vote at that point. It was more the sort of the links that had been formed and the friendships became more important than the suffrage, though that they still believed firmly in it.
So when when French and British troops came to other countries, like Greece, for instance, did they bring their own nurses with them, or did they use nurses from Greece? And generally, how did nurses cope with being so far away from their homelands, especially Australian, US nurses?
Generally, they brought their own nurses. And for example, when the Americans entered the war and went overseas, then their nurses went over with them. So they tended to have their own nursing services that accompanied them to wherever they were going. Frequently, they were official ones. Sometimes, as with the Scottish women's movement that I mentioned, the ones that were formed by the suffrage societies, they tended to be privately funded and organized, but they tended to take their own nurses with them. I think, and I know very little about it, shamefully, I think the big exception would have been the Indian troops. But there were hospitals that were set up particularly for Indian soldiers. And then my recollection, my knowledge, is that they tended to recruit nurses who had some experience of India, who, for example, had been part of Anglo-India and had been born in India, and some spoke some of the languages. But other than that, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the South Africans tended to come overseas with nursing contingents as well, and then they would follow them, the Australians, to Egypt, and to wherever they were going. A certain number would go with them.
Yeah, because I was wondering also about India at one point, because of the large cultural differences, and how, and maybe even without those differences, men were not always comfortable with strange women attending them.
This became a great issue, and it became a big issue in the specifically Indian hospitals that were set up. In that, whereas for most tasks female nurses were involved, they were for the dirty or intimate work. It wasn't considered appropriate for white women to touch coloured men, so then it tended to be the orderlies. But I think there was also, it's very easy to condemn that out of hand. I think there also would have been considerable embarrassment and awkwardness on the part of the wounded soldier if he were being tended by a woman. I think there is that cultural difference that perhaps we should pay some attention to. It's very easy to just sort of see it in a particular way, but I think for the troops themselves, they may have been more comfortable with their own orderlies in some respects. But certainly the care that was given to the Indian soldiers in the official hospitals that were set up, it was very high ranking. It was excellent care. They were, and a great deal of effort was made to sort of understand the cultural differences between the troops. You've got the Hindus and the Muslims, for example, and the Sikhs, and separate kitchens would be set up to cope with their dietary needs. So there was a cultural awareness there as well.
And one last question, because we're running out of time now. Were all nurses properly trained?
You've got, and this is a huge thing, and anybody who's interested in looking at pictures of nurses, a very, very quick way of identifying whether somebody is a professional nurse or an auxiliary nurse is if they have a red cross on their apron. If they have a red cross either on their apron, that would indicate that they're auxiliaries. They're not professionally trained nurses. And there was a huge hierarchy between the professional nurses and the volunteers. And the volunteers, they had some training, Red Cross training, whereas the professionals had undergone very, very lengthy, grueling training, and they were very understandably jealous to protect their roles, the professionals. They shook down together, if you like, eventually, the auxiliaries and professionals, but at the beginning it took quite a long time. But as I say, for anybody who looks at a picture and thinks, oh, that's a First World War nurse, look and see if there's that Red Cross on their apron, and it will tell you whether they are a professional or a volunteer.
So it was more like a matter of training of days or weeks and 1 month.
Yes.
And year.
For the professional nurses, it was years. It was a 3-year training, often very expensive, very, very grueling. Whereas the volunteers would have undergone would have got nursing certificates, Red Cross provided certificates. And to begin with, they were not really particularly efficient, but they learned very quickly on the job. And some of them became highly expert themselves. And it was after the war when they were offered the opportunity to train as nurses. I think they were given a year's exemption, but they weren't automatically qualified as nurses.
So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Sorry about the blip with the technology at the beginning when we thought we had it all running.
Not at all, not at all. It was really fascinating, and learned quite a lot. And I think we can all end this with appreciating nurses so much more, especially at these times at the moment. So thank you again for your brilliant talk. And
thank you so much. And I look forward to listening to some other ones. Thank you.
For listening, and please tune in next Thursday at 6 p.m. when we have Mel Eisenberg here talking about dangerous comparisons, historical pandemics and COVID-19. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.